Yeah. So, Bruce, we're talking about finding the right distance in a meditative approach or a
Mm.
mindful approach.
Mm. So let me just say some introductory things about it, because I have actually, since we talked about doing this, been kind of thinking about it. The first part is something that I've said a lot. I'm sure I've said it to you, but for our discussion, it might be good for me to repeat it, which is my original interest in the issue of right distance came from Gene Genlin himself. And his quote, which he actually had said to me some many years ago, but then I saw someplace where he wrote it as well. And that was, he said, if you want to know how the soup smells, don't stick your nose in it. And it is, for me, very clarifying and really is as good a definition as right distance as possible. And so from that, I have derived a kind of schema in which I see there being three basic distances from our experience. There's zero distance, which is more like the Zen approach, which is if I'm making love to someone, I want no separation between me and my experience. I want to be fully in it, like the Zen of archery or the Zen of motorcycle maintenance or any of those kind of things. I want to be fully immersed in the experience. If I'm interested in doing something like self-exploration or focusing or any kind of self-inquiry, having some distance from my experience is extremely helpful so that I can pay attention to and be mindful of my experience, both without disregard nor over involvement. That there is a kind of, for me, I believe there is a natural kind of right distance, and it varies from day to day, from moment to moment, from conversation to conversation. My really crude way of saying that is, if I want to make love to somebody, I want no distance. If I'm about to stick a knife in somebody's heart, I need a little distance from my experience because I'm way too caught in it. And for me, there are three basic distances. There's that one, which is zero distance, which is fully immersed in that Zen kind of way or mindful kind of way, either one, of being fully immersed, committed to my direct experience. There is that focusing distance, which is, or focusing distance or self-exploratory kind of distance in which I'm able to observe without much static.
Mm-hmm.
So that if I'm trying to pay attention to something and it disturbs me, I am very likely to be too close. If I can talk glibly about some difficulty I'm having, I'm probably too far away from it. There may be a better way, and I've actually been thinking this recently. There is a kind of relational distance where I feel separate from, but connected to my experience. So maybe we could talk more about what that means. But then there is a meditative distance in which I am more fully observing. It's like I am not directly connected to the experience, but I am fully able to observe it and to pay attention to it, but not interact with it in the way I would in a focusing distance. I'm just more really separate and able to just observe. Sometimes with trauma, that third distance really is important. because it's very hard to be in a relational distance with something that is traumatizing. Whereas I feel like most of us are more able to have that kind of meditative distance from something that is really on the level of trauma or on the level of really deeply disturbing. And so any distance that's too close to it is likely to throw me off guard. I guess that's all. There's a lot more in there, but for right now, I think that I just want to make sure that that part gets clear, because it is really the best way to define what is interesting to me, is finding some place that is in right relationship and right distance from my experience.
Yeah. So how do you find the distance? Do you want to give some examples?
Yeah.
And how you do it?
Okay. Well, I will just try to describe it, though I'm not sure if my experience is all that generalizable, but maybe it is. The example I used in that thing that I just wrote and that you read is obviously kind of on my mind since I just wrote it. That I'm having some difficulty in my life, so a situation of some kind, and I try to share it with a friend, and before I ever really fully even tell them about the situation, they start to give me advice. I find that aversive, like it grades at me in an uncomfortable way. When I was younger, I would often just get angry about it and put a big wall between me and the other person. As I have aged and as I have gotten a little more sophisticated, I can turn my attention towards the disturbance. But if I do that too quickly or too demandingly, I just get anxious and upset and disturbed. But on the other hand, if I can just say, oh, let me pay attention to how that actually feels in there, something in me is capable of relaxing and noticing that my heart rate has gone up, that there's tension in my solar plexus, that my breathing has altered some. And in the paying friendly attention to all that, I am able to really pay it to observe it in an open, friendly way, rather than trying to tell myself that I shouldn't feel that way. My friend really didn't mean anything by it. All the self-talk things that we ordinarily do. They are self-talk in that way can be helpful, but not deeply helpful. Whereas really noticing my physical reaction to such things and being generous with myself about my reaction without judging it frees me to really be not be so identified, which is the way I was trying to write about it in that paper, not being so identified either with the part of me that gets hurt or angry, or who judges me for being reactive. Like, not judging myself for any of that frees me up to just pay attention to it in a kind of open, easy way.
Yeah.
And I can be kind to parts of myself that are either really hurting or really angry or really distrustful. whatever.
So what I'm hearing is the way that you find distance
Uh-huh.
is not something like giving yourself general comment about finding some distance, but actually orienting toward it in a different way, by having some curiosity about what the experience feels like. And so physically, for instance,
Yeah.
um,
Primarily
primarily.
physically.
And so by engaging your curiosity
Mm-hmm.
about the experience, you actually end up being a bit outside the experience because there's an observing self that's engaged.
Right.
And so there's more to you than the experience. And
Right.
the observing self feels outside of the experience and far enough to not be swallowed by it.
Uh-huh.
And so from that perspective, you have distance.
Uh-huh.
So just checking that's what you mean by distance in that case. And that's a meditative distance.
Well, that's for me more like a focusing distance.
Okay.
If the disturbance is really greater than my ability to turn towards it and start to really listen in an open-minded way, then I tend to switch to a more meditative distance. And in that case, I actually do some prep work. I will actually sit and just be directly with what my physical sense of the moment is. And I will just sit with that, not really turning even so much towards the trauma, but just really being more literally involved or paying attention to my reaction. And then I can begin to actually pay more direct attention to the reaction itself, which is more than just the sensations. It has lots of parts, lots of moving parts. So does that make it clearer or not?
Yeah. So I'm not sure how I would summarize it. So would you mind summarizing it to see?
Oh, that's a good idea. That, yes, in general, my method of finding right distance is through paying attention to the sensations in my body, particularly those that are related to the disturbance. If I cannot do that with some facility and ease, I then tend to get more distance. I actually turn towards something that looks like meditation, which is like a lot less involved with any of it. It's more like I have a self that is capable of being separate, really separate from all of that. And when I feel at ease, I can then start to turn towards that which is at dis-ease.
Yeah.
But I have to first establish a kind of equanimity in myself before I can begin to turn towards the whatever the disturbance is, the unhappiness, the anger, the anxiety, whatever that disturbance is. I can't turn towards it until I've first established a kind of equanimity, and then I can begin to turn towards that which is disturbing.
Yeah.
If it's not so large, I can just kind of turn towards it and begin to really enter into a kind of relational observing. It's not, then it's not so distant. It's like there's a part of me that's already looking to be friendly with the sensations and be friendly with the discomfort.
Yeah.
So
So,
the degree of discomfort makes a difference in how I go towards right distance.
right. So it's all driven by the degree of discomfort.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, I would like to observe that that is my own personal process. But I think recently I sent you, with their permission, the people in my focusing class, I asked them to describe how they find right distance in their own lives and in their own process. And there was actually quite a bit of variation. And I
Yeah.
have noticed in my clinical work that with each person I work, they each have their own way of starting to find it. That once after they have the notion of right distance, of what it feels like to be in right distance and right relationship with something, they begin to find their own path there. And so the variations of approaches is almost as large as the number of people I have worked with and who I do work with in my focusing group. There's not one size fits all kind of thing in there. I think it's different for each of us.
Yeah. So essentially, first thing when possible is shifting your curiosity to sensation.
Mhm.
And when not, um, to be observing whatever is happening with yourself.
You know, Serge, actually something came to me about, I was remembering some of the things my students said. But at the moment, what strikes me is I, or any of us who get interested in the issue of right distance, have to find some place to stand in relationship to our experience where we can say yes to our experience and not reject it. And sometimes that can be, pretty ordinary and easy. And sometimes that can be terribly difficult when have some reason to reject my experience. For example, if I turn towards anger, using that as a slightly different example, if what arises in me is anger in response to my friend's advice giving, I have to find some place inside of me where it's really okay for at least for me to feel that anger, even if not willing or able to express it. But I have to find some place where I can say yes to the anger and give myself permission to feel what it is I feel, even if I don't wish to be run by it.
Right. So the distance is a very necessary alternative to avoiding the experience. It is finding the distance at which you can tolerate the experience.
Yes, I think tolerate, I have a little trouble with tolerate because I'm a little more ambitious than that. That is certainly at one end of that continuum. But my goal is always to find full acceptance of the feeling, not to reject my natural, anger or my natural reactivity to whatever experience, like my friend giving me advice. Like I have to have freedom to have my reaction and yet not be so identified with it and not be so controlled by it, but just aware of it.
Yeah,
And
so
being
we're
friendly
talking about
towards it.
finding the distance at which you can have acceptance.
Right.
It's
Right.
more than tolerating, it's
Yeah.
acceptance.
And sometimes the best I can do is to tolerate. So it's not like, there's any slam dunks available in there. But as I have worked on this over the years, I find it easier and easier to find a place of acceptance. But that has been a fairly long, intense process.
And the two obstacles to acceptance, one of them would be a should.
Mm-hmm.
You should not behave that way, or you should behave in a certain way, or you should
Right.
feel a certain way. And the other being the intensity of pain or shame or whatever else.
Right. And willingness to acknowledge it and give it credence or give it some acceptance. That's right.
Right. And so we're not saying that the intensity of pain is automatically a deterrent to finding that acceptance.
That's right.
If you could very well say, I just, this is really painful, I don't want it, but I have it and I'm accepting the reality of it.
Yes. Yes.
So how does it happen that you find the acceptance? Is it self-talk, or is it, how does it happen?
And for me, it is rarely self-talk. I find self-talk gives me a phony version of that, but it rarely really helps me go there. For me, it's much more about really noticing, bringing my attention. It's interesting, Bruce Nayawith and I just had an exchange about this, and he was objecting to mindfulness and awareness as important and primarily important in this process, because for him, it's the living it out. And so the awareness for him is actually intrusive in a certain way. And I said to him, could we agree on the word attention? So in effect, what I am working towards in my language would be something closer to mindfulness, but in his language is more like just being able to bring my attention to that which on the surface is quite aversive or discomforting.
Yeah. So the pain, the intensity make it hard to tolerate, even less accept. And the way that you get in that direction is to engage with the sensation.
It is, but I thought what you asked me before was really helpful. It's true that that's an accurate statement, but it's also true that having an awareness that right distance exists is also helpful in finding it. So I think that's important, that when I sit, I am not naive, or when I sit with a problem like that of having some excess anger or excess anxiety or whatever, if I start with an awareness, it is possible to come into a friendlier relationship with it. And I am looking, my job is to look for that friendly place where I can be with it in a friendly way, is helpful in itself. And then turning towards sensations inside of that context then is much easier to do.
Yeah, so
I know what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so there is an intentionality of reminding yourself that through experience time and again, you have found that it generally makes things easier to accept feelings, sensations.
Yes, right. Yeah, I would say that's true. It's funny, it's not my usual way, but yes, that's true. It's clearly true that my experience is embedded in that process. So when I'm turning towards my sensations, it is with some sense that it will lead me to a place of feeling related to whatever it is that's disturbing.
Right, right. So there is a practice. So it's something about
Yeah,
the practice of turning to your experience builds the muscle to do it when it's difficult.
yes.
Because you then have that body memory that it's okay. You actually can handle it better.
Uh-huh. Also, I think it's worth mentioning, I'm not sure it's directly relevant to what we're talking about, but I can remember conversations that you and I have had over time in which it is also helpful if there's an other in the situation, like a friend who's giving me advice. It is really helpful if they have a sense of all of that. And if I'm in a relationship with them, that I feel free to share my reaction with them, and that they will come to an understanding about that rather than turn it into some big argument about, whether they did something good or bad or wrong or right or something,
Right.
And,
So
and
we're talking about
the relationship with the other does in fact help, or can help.
so we're talking about generalizing the concept of acceptance, not just you accepting yourself, but
Right.
the other person also accepting whatever is happening, including your comments, your reactions.
Right. Yeah.
So it seems like my visual of this distance
Uh-huh.
becomes more related to making room. And one way to make room is to zoom out, because as you're in the distance, that there's more room around the main topic, the self.
Yes.
But more generally, that the operative word, instead of just distance, is actually, for me, something about make room for.
Making room for. That's right.
Making more room for, being less focused on one thing and having a little more peripheral vision in it, including more than just what is painful.
Actually, that's a really good point, Serge. And I would just like to add to it, because it does actually then connect with other parts of this in a way that I hadn't actually put it together. But when you say that, I hear it. I'm creating a spaciousness around myself. So whatever self means in that context, I mean, I know that we could get into a whole long discussion about what self is, but it is true that if I can create some space around me and I feel in a spacious place inside, it then helps me be able to face things that are distressing, because I am not doing it from a cramped, small space. I'm doing it from a more open space that gives me more latitude and more freedom to try out different things. There's a kind of freedom that comes with that spaciousness. And when I think of a focusing space, or a self, like a capital S kind of self, it exists in a larger space. So I just wanted to kind of underscore what you said.
And so now it's sinking a little bit more with what you had written about the contraction.
Uh-huh.
And so the image that comes to mind is, okay, so when I feel, when you feel, when we feel a
Uh-huh.
sense of contraction and a sense of intensity about the self, for better or worse, without
Uh-huh.
defining that, just but
Uh-huh.
something about there's a kind of a poignancy and an intensity about what's happening to me.
Mhm.
And so then it tells me that maybe I am hyper focused on me
Uh-huh.
and I need to kind of open up.
Uh-huh.
And that taking some distance is like zooming out or walking backwards in order to be able to see more than
Yes.
for me, or that hardship, and be
That's
able to have a sense of more.
that's beautiful, Serge. In fact, I would add to it. For a long time, and even now sometimes, if I'm working with a client in this way, I will say to them, which is easier, you taking a couple steps back or asking the whatever is uncomfortable to move further away from you? And I would say it's often it's a 50-50 toss up, that some people can ask the feeling to move further away so they have more space in which to really listen, or they themselves have a sense of being able to step away from something, which actually gets me to a really important part of this that I have not talked about very much.
Yeah.
There is a discomfort, a very particular kind of discomfort, which alerts me or any of us to when we're too close. When I look around, most people live way too close to their experience much of the time. Like, we feel uncomfortable, and that discomfort for me is very often a signal that I need to back away from something, or I need to ask the something to move a little further away from me. But I need more distance from it in order to be able to address it and develop a different kind of relationship with it. So it's really good that you said that. It's
Yeah.
helpful.
But so it's something similar, say, when, say, working with a couple
Mhm.
and figuring out, how they are. I can sometimes ask them to move a little closer, a little farther, and checking, is this close? Can you go closer, or do you want to go farther? And finding that distance from each other in a way that, you could not find in a logical way, but kind of sensing what distance feels right.
Right.
And so that sense of doing that no matter what, when facing the experience of saying, I'm not going to take it for granted that where I am is the right distance, but I need to try a little bit forward and a little backward, either my moving out or telling it to move in or out, in order to actually actively discover what the right distance is for me
Beautiful.
at this moment.
Experientially discover.
Experientially, yeah.
I love that. I want to add something to that, Serge, which is, I think you probably know about this, but it still feels really good. Angel and I did a workshop a few years ago in which we used a thing called the, oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called. There's a protocol, but it's, the touch, something touch, but I can't remember what it's called. But the first exercise that you do is meaningful in just this way, so that people who have fear of touch, right, partner up with somebody who agrees to move closer, physically closer or further away at their instruction, and only touch them when they give the other person permission to touch them, and where and how much and in what way. And so that the person who's fearful has an opportunity to set all the parameters so that they are able to find literal right distance from the other person, so that they can invite the person to come closer as they are in fact comfortable.
Mhm.
And it's a literal expression of right distance.
Right. And so it feels obvious that, say, in a dyad of two well-meaning people, it's going to be possible to ask the partner to move
Mhm.
farther, closer, and that the person will do it.
Right.
But when we're caught in a situation that is viscerally very affecting, like an
Uh-huh.
intense fear,
Uh-huh.
um, there is a sense of powerlessness about the fear.
Right.
And, and so from that place, it's not easy to conceptualize that you can ask the fear to move out and it will, or to that you will move out and the fear will not cling to you.
Uh-huh. So I would love to respond to that. Yes, I want to say first, just yes, that's really right. But what I would add to it is being aware of the distance between yourself and your experience is empowering. And it's interesting that you said that, because when I feel really overwhelmed by something, I begin to have a sense that it is possible to step away from it. That knowing that it is possible at least sets me in a direction of being able to put a little space between me and that which has been overwhelming. And so there is an empowerment in finding right distance, in just knowing that it's oppressive to be too close to something that's overwhelming. And
Okay.
that,
So let me try it
sure.
to voice it. So the experience is, okay, so right now, the fear is intense. So I am right at ground zero of the fear.
Uh-huh.
And the fear is tagging onto me, clinging onto me, so that I can neither move back nor push it away.
Uh-huh.
But I am aware that I am in such close distance, and being aware of it is something that's an opening for feeling less overwhelmed.
That's very right. It's very close. I would add to it that for me and for a lot of the people I tend to work with, it's a signal to begin to pay attention to the physical sensations, that I sometimes am capable of really noticing the impact of being stuck too close to something which is either overwhelming or really uncomfortable. But
Okay,
that
so
if I can just switch my attention to the sensations involved, it begins to create a door for me to step away.
yeah. So I'm going to repeat it, in
Okay,
my own words
sure,
there.
sure.
So um, the intensity of that visceral experience, the intensity of the fear, for instance,
Uh-huh,
makes it hard to push away or to move back.
uh-huh,
But as I become aware of it and I accept the reality that at this moment I'm caught in it
uh-huh,
and there is no possibility to create distance,
uh-huh,
then I shift into saying, well, if I'm stuck here, I might as well direct my attention to the sensation of what it feels like to
right,
be stuck in that scary, overwhelming, and
uh,
powerless place. And I'm going to direct my attention to have curiosity about the sensations. And in doing that, I have gained a little distance.
Yeah, that's actually beautifully said, Serge. So yeah, I want to say yes. Curiosity, interestingly enough, in my view, is a pretty ambitious place. Like by the time I am capable of being curious, I'm already got one foot out the door. But if I can't get to curiosity, and some people can, this is where all those individual differences really show up. But for me personally, and for a lot of the people I work with, curiosity comes later. That what I can have before I get to curiosity is just some sense of opening myself to what the experience is actually like. What is it like to be stuck here? And then if I can get to that kind of openness, then curiosity has an opportunity to come. And that gets mixed up sometimes or changes position with also being able to be compassionate or warm towards myself.
Yeah. So you point out something very important, that in an experience of high intensity, the curiosity or compassion are going to take time to come in.
Uh-huh.
And first is that sense of, even without being fueled by curiosity, just having the discipline, the body memory, the habit of shifting attention
Uh-huh.
toward what it feels like.
Yes. Beautifully said. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. But then, playing devil's advocate,
Please.
very high intensity visceral fear.
Uh-huh.
Under these circumstances, the fear is not going to leave much room for, oh, I'm interested in what it feels like,
Uh-huh.
because essentially, physiologically, the fear is about closing down any mind resources that are not oriented toward fight flight. And the resource of being able to observe is something that is available when you have some mindfulness circuit involved.
Any space.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So you're talking about, just that there will always be a small space to start.
I would say it differently, because it's obviously not true that there is always a little space. One hopes for even a little space, even a small space, which can grow into something larger. So there's no guarantee there's going to be any space. But what I would say is that it is a project. It's not the best word in the world, but it is a practice to begin to look for that space and to give that space some attention and some interest, and just to look for it. Is there any place in me that can step away from the fear? And sometimes for some people, asking the fear directly to allow space can actually be quite effective for some people.
Yeah.
Over the years, I've watched people develop a dialogue with that kind of fear, and it does shift. The fear looks much bigger before the dialogue than by the time the dialogue actually happens.
Yeah. You used the word practice.
Uh-huh.
And I want to stay there for a moment.
Okay, sure.
Because practice implies something that's been done,
Uh-huh.
and that's there's a training in it. There is something that reinforces an ability. So it's not just reinventing this at the moment when there is an intense emotion,
Well said.
but
Yes.
it's something in which there is a training which then makes it possible to have some degree of distance
Right.
when the intensity is really high.
Yes, beautifully said. My friend Gary has a term for that, which I love. He calls it subjective literacy. Isn't that a great term?
Beautiful term, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. No, that's very interesting because obviously literacy is about the ability to do something that's essential, that you cannot take for granted without that practice.
Right.
I like subjective because we tend to think of subjective as opposed to objective, therefore second rate. But in this case, subjective is something about functioning as a subject. The literacy, the habit, the practice of knowing yourself
Yeah.
as a subject, therefore having some agency, therefore what your subjective experience is something that is meaningful and has to be cultivated.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I'm sure Gary would object to this, but in my mind, in some ways, it's just following neural pathways, right? Learning about what kind, in that article that I wrote that you just read about the relationship between right distance and contraction, there is a way in which I am learning to really accept and notice and learn about my reactivity and get to know it in a way that it's normal and fine and not so disturbing that I have a human reaction. And yet I get to know about it and not be so involved in it or reactive to it. I have enough distance from my reactivity that I can be accepting, but not submerged in it.
Right. So I'm trying to reword it somewhat.
Okay, please.
And see if I got it. But there's a bit of a sense of, almost an ironic quality to it, that you're talking about reactivity and you're talking about actually having less reactivity toward noticing your reactivity.
Right, exactly. Beautifully said. Exactly. Yes, that's right. Finding a place in me that feels big enough and spacious enough that I can accept whatever all that machinery is like in there, that I become more literate about my own reactivity.
Right. So it becomes in some way finding something that you can accept.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Or at least move in that direction towards self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But more generally, I'm curious about whether the concept of finding distance can be described as finding some place or something that you can accept.
It's a good question. Let me sit with it for a minute, sir. That's a really good question. I would say not, actually. I would say it like this, that really the first step of right distancing, whatever it means, is to recognize the relationship that I have with whatever it is that's disturbing me or whatever experience I'm wanting to explore. It doesn't have to be a disturbing experience, but that's where we tend to go. And so I would say the first step is recognizing the shape and nature of my relationship to, for example, fear, since that's the example we were using. That, as you said it, there are times in which the fear seems so large and so encompassing that I feel just stuck in it. That is a particular kind of relationship. I am, in one way or another, subservient to the fear in that picture.
So let me stop a little bit here.
Sure.
Because we have two levels here. We're talking about the relationship to the experience, to the feelings, to, and in this case, to fear. But fear itself is the nature of your relationship with the situation. So we're talking about, at the moment, the situation, say something is scary. So, or speaking for myself, something is scary to me, means my relationship to this thing is fear. And then we're talking about another level, which is saying, what is my relationship to that reaction, which is fear? So what is fear is my relationship to the situation. And then I'm exploring my relationship with fear.
Beautiful. I want to say to you, fear is not your relationship to the thing. Fear is your reaction to the thing. That's a very different state.
Oh, absolutely. Very nice point. Okay, so we're talking, so here also, maybe that's a more generalized point that you're talking about. You were talking before about reactivity. And so we're talking here about things that are not responses that involved all of us, all that we have, but they're knee-jerk reaction, their reactivity.
Right.
And so that the first step is reactivity. And this is engaging our mindful ability to go beyond reactivity.
Right. Or step outside of the reactivity. In terms of distance, you're stepping outside the reactivity, not go beyond. Because as soon as I try to go beyond, for me, it becomes I should go beyond very quickly.
No. But somehow when we're talking about it in terms of reactivity, there's something that I can't fully express. It feels a little easier. Because what the framework becomes for me is, this intensity that I feel right now, for argument's sake, of fear or whatever, is not the intensity of the only possible way of responding to the situation. It's the intensity of my knee-jerk reaction, of my reactivity. And I have experience, practice, if you want, of other situations in which I have time and again discovered that there is something else than reactivity that works better for me. So something about, okay, so I'm realizing that this is reactivity, and stepping back for a moment in order to access something else.
Right. Beautifully said. Absolutely. That's right. The stepping back is why, for me, right distance is so important, is that if I don't make some space between me and my reactivity, even if my reactivity is fear, my first job is to make some space between me and that reaction.
Yeah. And so very interesting that we're not talking just about, it may be important to make distance between me and the situation itself.
Right.
But we're also very much talking about making some space between me and the reactivity.
Right.
And so it might end up being some space from the situation itself.
Right.
But I think there's something that feels more helpful to me when I realize that it's not just that it's about making space from the situation, but it's about making space from my reactivity. And so my reactivity might stay stuck in the situation, if it cannot disentangle itself from it, but that's okay because I'm not my reactivity. And there is kind of that memory of there's something more to me than the reactivity.
Beautifully said. I do want to remind you, or at least open the discussion, that I wrote a paper about, I just read it in preparation for this conversation, actually, about the similarities and differences of right distance from the other, whatever the other is, including some situation out there. There is a right distance between me and the situation, and there's a right distance inside of me from my own reactivity. And they are related, those two kinds of right distance. The one outside and the one inside are related to each other, but they're not synonymous. There are real differences between them. And I think that's really, for me, very helpful to note that.
Right, right. And so, for instance, when you were talking about that example you were talking about the friend coming in with advice before even finishing listening to you, there is a way in which your reactivity is something you don't have the power to act on at the moment, but you have more of the ability to find distance from your reactivity.
Right. Yeah. And in different circumstances, my taking action outside might be more possible and important than my taking action inside. And other times it's the opposite. So, for example, if I'm with someone who is friendly towards me, then my need for distance from them gets lower. And often it then gives me a freedom to feel closer to my own feelings, including my reactivity. So there is a difference. Whereas on the other hand, if the other person is in fact really hostile or difficult, then my getting more distance from them in an outside sense, maybe literal, maybe just getting out of their presence, then helps me begin to find right distance inside. It goes back and forth. So there is a relationship between what I mean by right distance inside and an awareness of the importance of right distance outside.
Right, right. So yeah. So there's something about the field itself, what's happening in a relationship.
Yes.
If there is a friendliness or in the relationship, then that in itself is going to permeate in making it easier for you to get distance from your reactivity and accepting your reactivity, because there is that connection that really makes it easier to accept.
Right.
And when there is more hostility, then it hampers the ability to have more distance from the reactivity. But on the other hand, what it does tell you is move out of the situation, find physical distance from it, close it, do something about the situation itself. And then this will take care of the reactivity.
Right. It's beautifully said. Thank you, Serge. When in a focusing like distance, in right relationship to and right distance from my experience, I often know which is right for me to get more distance from the other person out there, or if it's more important to me to find right distance from my own experience. But I have to first be in that spaciousness, in some kind of open, roomy space inside, in order to know which feels righter. Because it may be that the other is making me uncomfortable because they're telling me some truth that I don't want to hear, in which case I still need some distance from my own reactivity, but it might be really worthwhile for me to stay there in the situation because there's something really powerful and important to be gained there.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
each circumstance requires me to first be in a focusing space or an open space inside a spaciousness inside of me to make that decision in an unbiased way.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in a way, another way to put it is that sometimes, the reactivity in telling you to move away might be right or might be wrong, but you'll never know. What you know is there's probably something about not forcing yourself to disregard that, because if you force yourself to disregard it, you're in a place where it's impossible to really process.
Beautifully said, Serge. That's exactly right. I mean, I think you added to what I said, but I have no disagreement. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Just really well said.
What's also implicit in it is the role that practice has.
Mhm.
That it's clearly not something that you improvise, that's something that you build upon time and time and time again, so that it becomes more and more available as a resource.
Beautifully said. I want to respond to that because there is something I don't think I've quite articulated very well. I'm not sure if I ever have, but I'm pretty sure in this conversation I haven't. There is a natural sense of right distance. And I can notice in that kind of way that you're describing, I can notice when I feel cramped, whether it's I feel cramped by some internal reactivity or cramped because the other person is being pushy or something, or doing something that's, increasing my discomfort. But I can notice at any time what kind of space I'm living in. Is this a cramped, small space I'm living in at this moment? Or is it open? And if it's cramped, it's almost always traceable to not having enough distance, either from something inside or something outside. Because I feel cramped, like I'm being put into too small a space. And an awareness of being in too small a space is a very helpful awareness in my experience, that we ignore it way too often at our peril.
Right. So that sense in that experience, that sense of being cramped, is something that gives you a very strong clue of whether you have enough space or not.
Yes.
Just as, for instance, if you're in a cave that's very small and you're cramped, it means you need more space.
Right.
And this is what happens in a situation that there is that sense of cramped that corresponds to what the situation is.
Right. Yeah. Either internally or externally. That we can be claustrophobic because of what's going on inside of ourselves or what's going on outside.
Right. So essentially the feeling cramped is a sense of, one way or another, I have to find a way to make more room.
Right. Yes, exactly. And more room in most circumstances means finding right distance, that they're making more room is equatable with finding right distance.
Right.
Beautiful. That's really cool, Serge. Thank you.
Yeah, it is cool. Thank you.
I guess I would like to add one note to that. That I would say that a lot of the people who work with me become sensitized to that, what kind of space they are living in at any given moment. And that's a really helpful piece of this that I think I haven't articulated all that much, but I think is really helpful, is being sensitized to what does it feel like inside of me? Does it feel cramped and small, or does it feel large and spacious, or someplace in between, is really helpful to this whole issue. Like it has in it a kind of seeking freedom.
Yeah. So here we are walking away from the specifics of a given situation, and we're talking about a general sense in life. And so that general sense in life is of having enough space versus feeling cramped in life.
Uh-huh.
So this, of course, is going to carry forward in specific situations, but this is something that goes beyond any specific situation because it's a general pattern.
Yes. In fact, I could imagine designing an entire meditation method around just awareness of what kind of space am I living in.
Well, let's play with that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Would you like to take a shot at it? You want me to do it?
No, absolutely. Let's do it together.
Okay. Okay. So then let's do it, Serge. As long as we do it the way we do it. Take a moment inside of yourself. What kind of space are you in now, here in this conversation?
I'm in a space of feeling like watching something unfold. The watching doesn't quite feel right. To feel of being in the middle of something unfolding.
Uh-huh.
A space of like in a gentle stream with a floater.
Uh-huh.
And the sense of moving in a way that's fast enough, but not too fast, and seeing more stuff coming up as I move down the river, kind of gently down the stream.
Wow. Beautiful. So I take it that with that comes a kind of openness.
Yeah.
And a freedom.
Yeah, but it's interesting because when I would say that the sense itself was that openness and freedom. Once I use the metaphor of being on a river
on a
with
raft,
a float in a raft,
yeah.
there is a little bit more of, I am not in control, that I don't have during the situation itself. It's more the metaphor that brings it up.
Of not being in control?
Of of the flow being in charge, being in,
Mm-hmm.
in the conversation, in the situation itself,
Uh-huh.
I feel very comfortable
Uh-huh.
in the flow.
Uh-huh.
But the image I chose, for some reason,
Uh-huh.
brings a little element that's mostly fun.
Uh-huh.
So let me change the image a little bit.
Okay.
So it's a summer.
Uh-huh.
So there's kind of a sense of warmth that's very relaxing.
Uh-huh.
I'm on the raft in a river that I've gone through before.
Uh-huh.
So I know there's nothing to anticipate, like, say, rapids or big rocks or whatever. And therefore, I am relaxing, letting the flow carry me.
Uh-huh. Wow. It's beautiful. That's a lovely image. So would you describe that as spacious or spacious with some limits?
So just sticking for a moment, the knee-jerk reaction is to say spacious. Then I kind of ask and I say, well, in what way is it spacious?
Uh-huh.
And I could say, well, the sky is big, all this, but that's not what makes it spacious. What
Uh-huh.
makes it spacious is that my muscles are relaxed. So
Uh-huh.
there is kind of that felt sense of spaciousness.
Uh-huh.
And that's why I, felt before, like, the image of the just being on the river was not okay by itself. It needed the complement of having the fact that I knew that the road was not going to have any treacherous moments, and it's warm. And it corresponds to that sense of my body being open and relaxed. And that's
Uh-huh.
what has that sense of spaciousness.
Wow. Okay, so then I want to double back. So with you having said that, just kind of almost theoretically, can you imagine paying attention to whether you're in that spaciousness or not more often during your day?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I do it occasionally.
Uh-huh.
And but what helps is, when I do it, it's more of, oh yeah, this feels like a spaciousness, or this does not.
Uh-huh.
But there's an image there
Uh-huh.
that's more, so the paying attention has more of a marker to compare it to.
Uh-huh.
I usually have some implicit marker, like kind of vaguely remembering, like when it feels, but I
Uh-huh.
think it would help to have more of that sense of, yeah, how close is it to that kind of experience that I'm describing right now?
Uh-huh. Beautiful. So I would then go back to the thing we were talking about before. For me, my day is filled with expansions and contractions in this regard, in the way that we're talking about it. That there are times during my day that I feel expansive and large and curious, capable of real compassion or understanding for myself and the other. And there are times of real contraction, like if my friend gives me advice before I'm ready to hear it, and that I feel those kind of contractions. But it dawns on me frequently that being aware of that contracting and expanding really helps me understand myself in a much deeper way.
So what I'm hearing you say is that in addition to what we were discussing before,
Uh-huh.
is paying attention to a specific situation
Uh-huh.
and paying attention to your reactivity, there is now a broader sense in which you are now at a different distance and saying, oh, yeah, that's life. That's that
Uh-huh.
mixture of expansion and contraction. So, this very specific expansion or this very specific contraction is one in a larger pattern. And
Yes.
saying there will always be situations during the day where there's moments of expansion and moments of contraction. And so this particular one I'm dealing with right now is not, the be all and end all, is not, that really poignant moment, but it's one of many.
Wow. Let me sit with that. It's really interesting. Let me sit with that for a minute. I love that, Serge. It's not where I go inside of myself, but when you say it, I can understand it in that way, and it offers me an additional view. I would say it's more like I have the sense of that in paying attention to contractions and expansions, I have a deeper understanding of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And coming to an acceptance of myself being both a contracting animal and an expanding animal takes me off of some hook. Because I think that for a lot of us, I don't think for everybody, but for a lot of us, we have this goal of being open all the time and in every situation. And I think that my interest in right distance keeps me from that kind of fantasy of always being open. It frees me to contract without it being a slam on my personhood.
Right, right. So the analogy would be if you were observing your breathing
Mm-hmm.
and feeling very judgmental when you breathe in or breathe out, as opposed to realizing both have to be there.
Yes, beautifully said. It's a wonderful metaphor. That's right.
And so what's coming up is a sense of that larger picture
Mm-hmm.
of there will be some expansion, there will be some contraction, there will be some finding distance, there will be moments where it's not the right distance, but it's all, there's that larger picture of this is life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And acceptance that sometimes I can't find right distance is really helpful.
Right.
Right, all of that. There's times when I will not be expansive, I will be in contraction, and that has to be okay.
Right. So we're looking for right distance with that understanding that we won't always find it.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's very cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, one of the people in my focusing group said it this way recently, because he's a person who really struggles with this in a pretty deep and effortful way. And what he said really resonated with me. And I wish I could say it more precisely, but I just kind of love what he said. He said, knowing that I am a person who tends to be way enmeshed with my experience, that I believe my experience, that learning and leaning towards and beginning to pay attention to right distance frees me from a kind of slavery to my experience. And as I get freer from that enmeshment, I begin to have a different kind of understanding and appreciation of my experience. I thought that was I wish I had his words more precisely, but that is basically was his comment. I think I'm pretty close.
Yeah. So that essentially gaining freedom from reactivity, because that intensity of being immersed in the experience is the reactivity.
Uh-huh.
And that sense of over time, which was very clearly indicated in what he said, through practice, developing an awareness, not just a cognitive awareness, but something that's an embodied residual experience, that there's more than reactivity.
Right. Yeah.
And so at any given moment, all we see is the reactivity, and there's that sense of opening up to see more than that.
Beautiful. Yes.